So we've gone over the pros and the cons of the mighty Imperial-class Star Destroyer, but I figured today we'll go over the right way to use an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, and how the Empire should have been deploying these vessels. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoy this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So as I mentioned in my positives of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer video, it does get a lot of flack. The ISD is often seen as a deeply flawed vessel that should have never been invested in to begin with, but I would argue that it is still a very capable and functional warship. So I figured today we can go over exactly how the Empire should have been using the Imperial-class Star Destroyer to get the most bang for their buck. But before we begin, I'm just going to briefly go over some of the disadvantages that will need to be balanced out. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer mostly abandons point defense in favor of heavy turbo lasers, which are great against capital ships, but basically useless against starfighters. The end result is they are very vulnerable to starfighters, but can take out nearly any other capital ship they come up against. The next is their exposed bridge, which is pretty common in Star Wars, but is specifically exploited on several occasions against the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, their bridge being positioned sort of high up. And you could rope into this, by the way, their rather exposed shield power generators, which, when taken out, knock out the shields for the entire vessel. But before we dive into how it should be used, let's talk a little bit about how the Empire was using it. They used it as a mainline warship, but in a lot of cases that meant the only warship. Imperial-class Star Destroyers in a lot of fleets were the only vessels, maybe being supported by smaller vessels like Gazantes or Architons, but often operating on their own, really. And while 3 Imperial-class Star Destroyers are remarkably intimidating, they do sort of leave their flaws wide open. Rebel starfighters knew that if they were facing any number of Imperial-class Star Destroyers, they could go in, hit their targets, and get out before most of the Star Destroyers could accurately respond. As a result, it left the Star Destroyer's flaws wide open. So how exactly do you counter this? How exactly are you supposed to use a vessel like the Imperial-class Star Destroyer? Well, as I mentioned in the video that went over the positives of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, they actually are really good if you look at them as battleships. Capital ships built from the ground up for direct engagements against other capital ships at relatively long ranges. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer perfectly fits this bill. Its massive array of turbo lasers are horrifically menacing against any other capital ship. Things like Mon Calamari cruisers, which are really advanced, still really have a hard time going toe-to-toe with something like an ISD. Where the Imperial Star Destroyer's flaws come in is when they come up against light vehicles like starfighters, for example. So the solution here is starting to look pretty obvious. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer is best used when escorted by smaller anti-starfighter vessels. Now, this is where we run into a problem. The Empire doesn't really seem to have any. Now, the Architons and Gazanti do have some point defenses, but both are geared toward very specific roles. The Architons serving as a mini battleship with a still relatively impressive array of turbo lasers, and the Gazanti serving more as a transport than a warship. So what the Empire needs is either a converted version of one of these two vessels to be an anti-starfighter corvette, or an entirely new vessel designed to fill this role. This could fill a role similar to what the Corellian corvettes filled with the Rebel Alliance, a nice anti-starfighter platform that could be bristling with point defense cannons and laser cannons to engage enemy starfighters. And then positioning these vessels above the Imperial-class Star Destroyer in the fleet would allow them to effectively protect the Star Destroyer's bridge and shield generators from attack. And while these light escort vessels are dealing with Rebel starfighters, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer could be holding off larger capital ships from being able to engage their smaller escorts. This system also doesn't require a larger fleet of Imperial-class Star Destroyers to cover their own blind spots, which the ISD does have a pretty large blind spot in the back. These blind spots could effectively be covered by their escorts, preventing Rebel starfighters from getting too close, but also giving the ISD a heads up if a capital ship is flanking it. But these escorts alone may not be enough to really make the best use of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Now, its fighter wing is relatively underwhelming. Only 70-something starfighters for its size is actually pretty small, but the real problem is their quality. If the Empire had swapped out the TIE Fighter for something slightly more advanced, something with a hyperdrive, not even shields, just a hyperdrive, which would allow it to enter hyperspace with the Star Destroyer and exit hyperspace in combat formation ready to engage an enemy as opposed to having to be deployed from the Star Destroyer upon arrival. This would further increase the Star Destroyer's ability to engage Rebel starfighters. And while 70 TIE fighters, while still imposing, may not be this insurmountable challenge, 70 of something like an X-Wing is a much larger, more capable, and more effective force. So when it really comes down to it, to effectively use the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, you need to at least support it with anti-starfighter escort vessels like corvettes and destroyers, and if you really want to make it as effective as possible, also give it a fighter wing of very capable hyperspace usable starfighters. However, as many of us know, this is not what the Empire did. Instead, they favored the cheaper options like TIE fighters and sided with smaller vessels that were basically just miniature Star Destroyers with tons of turbolasers and only questionable point defense against starfighters. This left ISDs incredibly vulnerable in combat, and this is why they get the bad rap that they do. But as I mentioned in this video, they're not completely worthless. There are some significant advantages to this massive vessel, and if you'd like to learn about some of the advantages of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, I'll leave a link up here to my video all on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think this is the best way to utilize an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Do you think I missed something that the Rebels could do to get around this tactic? Do you think that there is a better way to use this vessel? Or do you think the ISD is completely worthless and no tactic could save it from being a laughingstock on the battlefield? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, leave it down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.